Hello, and welcome to Dyslexia Devoted, the podcast dedicated to building awareness, understanding, and strategies to help those with dyslexia. I'm your host, Lisa Parnello, dyslexia therapist and founder of Parnello Education Services. Join me as we dive into today's episode of Dyslexia Devoted. Hello there, and welcome to episode 120 of Dyslexia Devoted. And today we are talking about doing things backward. And I mean that very, very literally. When we think about reading, we tend to think about going forward, as in I see letters in front of me and then I say the sounds that go with them. One thing that is equally important is to be able to do that the exact opposite direction. So today's episode is all about speech to print. So when we think about teaching kids to read, we always know we have to teach kids the letters and the sounds and how to sound out our words. But what is often left out is how to go the other direction. When we are teaching kids to read, we also need to teach them how to write. And in some ways, teaching them how to write also reinforces their reading skills. So one strategy that I include in all of my lessons is that we go forward for the first half of the lesson, and then we go backward for the second half of the lesson, using a speech-to-print approach. When I say a speech-to-print approach, that means that if I give you a sound, you can tell me all the different ways to spell that sound. And I would never do this all at once. We always start small with only one or two ways to spell a sound, and then we slowly build on it with really explicit teaching in the reading portion of our lesson before we do it in the backward version of our spelling portion. So you might be wondering why we do it this way. Oftentimes we have kids who become more fluent readers, but they're still kind of crummy spellers. And a lot of times when a kid has dyslexia, it is really important to be very explicit about what are the different ways to spell this sound and what are the reasonable options that I might use to spell this sound when I'm writing something. Often we think about kids going and reading correctly. When they go to spell things, you might start to wonder, how on earth did you get that? You would never use that letter in that part of a word. But kids don't know that unless we teach them. So this is where the speech-to-print approach is really important, and there's an entire book about it that I will actually go ahead and link in the show notes where you are listening to this podcast, or if you are on the Dyslexia Devoted newsletter, you'll automatically get it in your inbox when I do my Thursday emails. So when I'm doing a speech-to-print approach, for example, if I tell a kid, what are all the ways to spell O? I need them to be able to tell me it could be O with a silent E, it could be O all by itself in an open syllable, it could be OA, or OW. And then I teach them, how do we narrow that down? Where am I most likely to see this particular letter combination? So if it's at the end of a word, it's probably not OA. Every once in a while, there's something different like cocoa, but that comes from a different language. So we get cocoa or cacao, depending on how you pronounce it, depending on which language you're talking about. But oftentimes, there's a pretty reasonable pattern as to where you would find a particular spelling pattern. I know that OE and OW tend to be at the end of words or the end of a syllable, compared to OA, which is more commonly found in the middle of a word or syllable. And if we can make this really explicitly taught to kids, it really helps them narrow it down. Because if we tell a kid that there's 5 different ways to spell a sound, that can become really overwhelming. But if you show them that those 5 ways can actually be narrowed down to only 2 or 3, then they start to have a 50-50 chance of getting it right. And another thing that we can do with the speech-to-print approach is to have them say their sounds, spell it out with how they think it could be spelled, and then to write it with another spelling option. When we have our brains wired to read things, we can often tell when we've seen a word before if it looks right or not. We start to have that orthographic mapping of what does it look like when we represent these sounds on a page utilizing letters. And if I see 2 different spellings side by side, I can usually tell which one does not look right and which one looks more reasonable. Every once in a while, it might be a word you haven't really seen written down and you really are just taking a 50-50 guess. But if we can get kids closer to the right answer, that is our ultimate goal. Thank goodness for the world of technology. We have a lot of ways that we can utilize spell check and autocorrect and things like that to correct any mistakes as long as we are close to the right answer. And this is another way that speech-to-print approach really helps, is if we teach the kids different ways that I might hear a sound and how I might write that down to represent it on paper, I can help them get closer to the right answer. One of the big things kids don't always agree with is like, what do I need to learn how to spell? That's what spell check's for. But what they don't understand is if they have too many incorrect spellings within the same word, spell checker can't help them. Spell checker can't figure out what they're talking about if they've messed up 3 different patterns within the same word. So they need to be able to make minor changes to their spelling until they can fix it to get it close enough for spell check to help them. Or maybe if they can't use spell check. So many things these days are making kids write them all out by hand because they're so worried about cheating in ChatGPT and whatnots. Or sometimes if they're doing writing samples for school, they have to write them out by hand. So spell checker is not always an option. So we have to give kids the strategies and the tools that they need in order to become better spellers, which in turn actually strengthens their reading. If they have a really strong letter-sound relationship, both backward and forward, that develops much stronger, more fluent readers when they don't have to think so hard as to what these letters and sound representations are and how they're related. They need to be able to go both directions to be fluent for both reading and spelling. What happens if we don't use a speech-to-print approach and only use print first? Well, a lot of times if we're having a kid read and they try to sound out the words, that's great. And they might get a little bit stuck. But they can usually try to figure it out, especially if it's a word they've heard before. But then what happens when they go to do spelling activities? What happens when they go to write something down? One of the things that I was actually really surprised by when I first started switching to doing more of this speech-to-print approach, in addition to the regular decoding instruction I was doing, is that so often kids can tell you the letter names and then the sound they make, but they can't go in reverse. I was actually shocked at how many kids can't go backward and tell you all the different ways to spell a particular sound. Even if they've theoretically learned them, I'm using air quotes that you just can't see, sometimes they can't really execute them in the reverse order. If you give them the letters, they'll tell you what sound it makes, but sometimes if you give them a sound, they can't actually give you all the ways to spell that sound, which tells you that that letter-sound relationship is not really as strong as you think it is. And you need to be able to help the student know how to utilize their sounds no matter which direction it is. If you think about a kid going to write something down on a piece of paper, they will not tell you all the letters as they write them down. They will say the sounds as they go to spell the word. And when they're saying the sounds, we need it to be a really instant connection between the sound they're saying and the letter gets written on the page, or letters depending on what sound they're spelling, obviously. All right, I need to wrap this up because I actually have another student in just 5 minutes. So, to recap our episode for today, we talked about what is a speech-to-print approach. And that is when I give you a sound, you know in reverse which letters are correlated to that sound, as opposed to only going with knowing a letter and what sounds that letter or combination of letters says. We need kids to be able to go both directions to be truly fluent in both reading and spelling. We also talked about how that might look. If I give a child a sound such as O, I want that child to be able to tell me all the different ways they've learned to spell that sound and how it could be represented on paper in different ways. Often we will think a student is fluent in their sounds when really they're only fluent going one direction. And kids need to be able to both read and spell the patterns that they're learning. And too often we focus too much on going just forward with, I give you a letter, you tell me what sound it makes, but we don't go the reverse, and there are so many different spelling options in our language. It is a very opaque language, meaning it's hard to see through the patterns and know exactly which way we're going to spell a sound. Certain other languages are a little easier. When you hear a sound, it's always spelled a particular way. That is not the case in English, so we really need to focus on identifying what are the different ways that we can spell this particular sound. One key element is not overwhelming students, though, so we only give them a few sounds at a time until they master them for reading and spelling, and then we add on to that list. So I'm not going to give a kid 7 different ways to spell E all in the same day. I'm going to do a few at a time till they get really good at remembering them for both reading and spelling, going both forward and backward, and then I will slowly add on new sounds. We are not going to do it all at once. So like I said before, I will go ahead and link the speech to print book in case you want to learn more about this, wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. Or you can also get on the Dyslexia Devoted newsletter at parnelloeducation.com/email. And that way you get all the resources straight to your inbox every Thursday. All right, that's it for today. I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you want to learn even more about dyslexia, check out parnelloeducation.com/courses. See you next time.